Welcome to the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Talk that is a collaboration between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation of knowledge about New Mexico, the greater Southwest as a region, its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and Spain. The La Canoa Legacy Talks take their inspiration from the very word La Canoa, which can have several meanings. Here at the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, we have a more modern rendition, an artistic rendition of La Canoa, which you can see to my right. The piece here reminds us, el agua es vida. We also want our talks to create knowledge, inspire action, bring practical and useful information to community members, specialized researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, sociology, politics, and religious experience of our region.
I'm David Torres. I work with the education department, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here. I see some new faces, some friends from California visiting, and other familiar faces that have been here before. I encourage you to go to our website. There's many things happening. There's a very interesting movie today. There's always all sorts of events happening in the visual arts department. We're about to open our portrait. There's this really good collection from the National Portrait Gallery coming up and in our museum. I encourage you to check that out next week. Yeah, just visit our website, come to our events. You're here to hear a lecture. This is the Canoa series. Gabriel Melendez, it's the brain behind this series, and he's the one who's been in charge of getting all of these brilliant minds to share their knowledge with us here today. So, Gabriel, you want to present the Canoa?
Thanks, David. Okay, my bienvenida as well esta tarde. Thank you all for being here. This is the fourth talk in this series, La Canoa lecture series. Can you all hear me? I'm being heard. Actually, I'm very happy that Jose Rivera is here with us tonight because somewhere La Canoa got started in a conversation between him and I in passing, where we started talking about how important it is that we have a number of people that have been working on issues related to New Mexico and the Southwest generally, and how important it is to share that information with community and with others here at this center, which we think this is really a very nice place to hold the series because it's so nicely set up. And with that, I want to thank Rebecca Avitia, the director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, for embracing the idea when we first talked about it. And I want to thank David Torres, who's done all of the work of setting up the library tonight and provided coffee and other things for us to talk to enjoy as we continue the conversation. La Canoa is, just so you know, we selected the name because La Canoa can mean several things. It can mean the sloop rig canoe that's used in the Amazons, La Canoa, a canoe. It can also mean the flues that come off of the roofs on our adobe housed constructions, like this one here, where water is channeled off the roofs. It can also be a paddle that's used to take bread in and out of a hot oven. In all of those instances, the common denominator there is that it's useful, it's utilitarian. And that's why we want these talks to become useful and utilitarian and usher in a dialogue, that is, move ideas and conversation back and forth, just the way the canoa moves people across rivers or directs water where it needs to go, or saves us from burning our hands when we're working with hot objects. So with that, I would like to introduce Jose Rivera. And Jose is a research scholar at the Center for Regional Studies at UNM and professor of planning at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning. In 1998, he authored a book titled Acequia Culture, Water, Land, and Community in the Southwest. And that book was translated into Spanish in 2009 by the University of Valencia in Spain. His most recent book was published in 2010 titled La Sociedad, Guardians of Hispanic Culture Along the Rio Grande. And that last book is about mutualista organizations that were and continue to be active in our region. I hope you'll mention a little bit about the water courts in Valencia, because I know he's been there. But in any case, his talk tonight is Arreglos, entre vecinos. It's community building in the upper Rio Arriba area of New Mexico. And I turn it over to Jose.
Sí, gracias, Gabriel. Well, what a great place to give a talk like this. It's so intimate, so cozy, this circle of people. Thank you all for coming. I know it's been pretty chilly and cold the last few days with all this rain that we've been having, but that's good. It's good for the topic that I have, because I write and talk about irrigation. I write and talk about las acequias, the community ditches that we have here in New Mexico and southern Colorado. So definitely it fits in with what I've been studying now for many years, and I've given this, this is a very unique title, because when Gabriel invited me to come and be part of La Canoa, the legacy talks, I figured, well, I need to come up with something that really connects and brings together a whole variety of research projects that I've had for the past 30, 35 years. And I said, well, what is that? What's been the quest? What's been the direction and the goal that I've been having in having studied the acequias for these many years, 30 plus years by now? And I said, well, I think I'm getting closer. I have some basic questions that I've always had about acequias. We hear commonly used phrases like water is the lifeblood of the community. The acequias in particular are the ones that bond the community. They're the glue that holds the community together. I mean, we've been hearing that all our lives. Gabriel and his family and mine are from Mora County, and we certainly, have experienced that there. And we've actually seen it in action, during the springtime La Limpia, de la acequia. That's probably the perfect example of what keeps the community together. It's a time that after the cold winter months, in the snow, people have been indoors. They've, been enjoying la leña y la estufa y todo eso, Pero in the springtime, they have to come out. It's a duty. It's a requirement, And they do that, year in and year out when it's time to clean the ditch, the limpia de la acequia. Nobody has to order them, really. The mayordomos is in charge, of course, but it's a duty. I mean, people will drive in from, maybe if they live in Pueblo or Denver or other places, or Albuquerque, they'll go back to their roots. They'll go back to the place of their family, of their ancestors, really, and help out during that annual Limpia de Acequia. So the research projects that I've had have been getting me closer to answering this question of what is it that binds the community together, holds the people together, and they stay in place. This is a very, place-based, kind of culture that we have here. We never forget our roots, even those of us who have moved to Albuquerque or somewhere else. We always go back to where we came from. And so I figured, well, I'm getting closer to that, because that was part of the questioning and discussion that Gabriel and I had about, well, after 30-some years of research for many of us that are at the university, what is it that has motivated? What's been our research agenda, basically our research goal? And have we reached the conclusion yet and the finding. And interestingly, I still haven't, but I'm getting a little closer, and that's what I'm going to share with you. I think the title that I chose, like I said, this is a little bit different kind of top title that I would have for a talk like this, but I think it expresses that, to me, the la raíz, or the roots of community, really the foundations of community in el Rio Arriba, Arreglos, entre vecinos. So with that, let me kind of describe that a little more. I mentioned that I've been at the university, or research professor, for over 30 years. I started in 1982. I'm still there. I'm not retired yet. And these are some of the early projects, and then even to the ones that I have today. I started with a very basic one called Acequias y Sangrias. It was funded by the New Mexico Humanities Council. And it was a series of public events, public lectures, and a collection of photographs. I also collected memorabilia and bylaws and reglas de las acequias. I collected handwritten minutes of meetings. I collected, treasurers' ledgers and things that mayordomos and the officers of the acequia keep. And so as a result of this, and the public lectures that we had, one was here in Albuquerque, one is in Española, and one was in San Patricio in Lincoln County. With that, then I put together the collection of material that we had put together and established an archive. There's actually an acequia archive at the University of New Mexico Zimmerman Library in the Center for Southwest, or Special Collections room, as they call it. Okay, so once I put that into the archive, I said, okay, well, what do I do now? The Sangrias project, that was more like a public lecture series, much like La Canoa is here this fall. And I said, well, I have the archive, so I'm going to spend some time going over all of the documents that I collected, and the ditch rules and the treasurer's ledgers, the mayordomo notebooks and everything else, and see what I can come out of it. Okay, so then that became my goal at that time, was to then write a book, essentially, because I had read chapters in books, I had read essays about acequias, and I had read magazine stories about acequias, but there really was no comprehensive book totally focused on acequias, okay? And so I said, well, okay, that's what I want to do. So in 1998, I finished it and published the book called Acequia Culture, Water, Land, and Community. Well, that was in 1998, right? That was some time ago. Then after the book was published, people would ask me, okay, well, what are you going to do next? What are you going to work on? You've already done what you set out to do with this topic. What are you going to work on next? And luckily, one of the people that asked me that was, at the time, a vice president of the Ford Foundation in New York, a former professor himself, Walter Coward, sociologist. And he came to a conference in 1998, which happened to be, that's the year the book was published, and also it was the Cuarto Centenario of New Mexico. And so I purposely tried to finish the book, and it did. It got published in El Cuarto Centenario. And he attended a conference at the Embudo Center. And he asked me, well, what do you want to do next? I said, well, I'd like to do a comparative study of acequias in other parts of the world. I know they're out there. They're in southern Spain. They're in Mexico. They're in Peru. There's even some of them in the Philippines, in Ilocos Norte. So then with his support, I applied for a travel grant to be able to go to these other locations around the world and do field work and collect and document some more, adding to what I had already done here. And with the support of the Ford Foundation, I did that for about 2 years. I'm still working on some of those documents. I'm working on a possible book publication on the acequias in the Philippines and Ilocos Norte. They're called, another term, sanjeras. More recently, I have been teaming up with other people from other disciplines, with hydrologists and geologists and economists and sociologists and other people in a multidisciplinary research project funded by the National Science Foundation. So as it turns out, what I started off with, what I was very basic research in terms of historical documents and sociological studies and reports and of those kind of elements. Now this field of acequias, the study of acequias has grown and it's becoming more increasingly complex because it has attracted people from these other disciplines that previously had not been studying acequias. And so that is the current research project that I have. And here's an example of it that is getting me into this question of, well, what are the roots of community? One of the basic conclusions that we came out of this National Science Foundation study, which is still in its final year, but the part that I'm connecting with is mutualism, mutualismo, that it seems like that's part of the glue that holds people together. There's this idea of mutual trust, or we could say in Spanish, confianza, ¿verdad? Because people, when they go out for La Limpia, for example, part of what motivates them, I think, is that there's an expectation that the others are going to be there. ¿Verdad? Los parientes are going to be there. Los vecinos are going to be there. Los primos van a estar ahí también, you know. So there's this knowledge and this idea in the collective, you know, memory of people that that's something that's really important. And so people show up. And that's really one of the basic conclusions that we're getting to in this study of community resilience, as we also say it, because you know, these other disciplines that have been studying the acequias that I mentioned, you know, that's really what they're interested in too. We've had people from other universities, from Indiana University, a doctoral dissertation was done in the Taos Valley, for example. We've had people from other countries, from Spain and Mexico, that have come here, and they want to find out more about the acequias. We have a current doctoral student from Italy who's at the University of New Mexico, one of Gabriel's students, who came here to New Mexico and has been studying acequias here too. And that's really one of the reasons, because they've heard about them and they say, okay, we know that they're in other parts of the world, but what about New Mexico? What makes it resilient there, that they've been here for over 4 centuries, since about 1598, the very first acequia at the confluence of the Rio Grande and the Rio Chama at what is now Chamita. That's the oldest ditch in New Mexico. And so that's really what people are questioning or wondering about, because if we can figure out what is it that holds people together in any community, okay, it could be Barelas here, or it could be Socorro down the highway here, or anywhere. And if we find out some, you know, answer to that, then maybe we can address other problems and other, you know, the human condition as a whole. And so that's part of what we're doing, is the resilience. And we're also looking at, well, what is the tipping point? At which point could there be some collapse maybe, or will I get asked that question a lot, will the acequias continue? How long, how much more? Another generation, another 2 maybe? Okay, so we're interested in that so that we can develop programs or strategies, you know, to support the acequia as a water management institution. Okay. These are the study sites, just very quickly. We've been studying the acequias in the Rio Hondo in Taos County, El Rito on the Rio Chama and Rio Arriba County, and then Alcalde stretch of the Rio Grande just north of Española. And so what is mutualism? The term derives from mutual help, ayuda mutua, in the context of the culture of water in the Rio Arriba. By the way, by the Rio Arriba, we don't mean just the county of Rio Arriba, but also really the whole region of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, which I guess in geography we really could describe it really as the northern Rio Grande, everything from La Bajada north into Colorado. There are other kinds of you know, definitions. Mutualista and mutualism is the collective and reciprocal forms of exchange and support for the common welfare based on the concept of confianza or mutual trust. That basically people help each other out, essentially, because that really has been the story of the Rio Arriba. That's the story of los arreglos entre los vecinos, because a lot of this mutual support came about before government stepped in. We know that government had a major role in social support networks and programs during the Great Depression. It became necessary for the government to step in and provide support. But before that, way before the Great Depression and the Social Security era and unemployment insurance and compensation and health insurance even, people took care of their own. They took care of their neighbors and vecinos and their own families. The question then that I have had now for 30 plus years, well, what are the raíces, what are the roots of this community? What are the foundations of community in the Rio Arriba? And I borrowed some of the concepts from people who study, write about acequia. Certainly Juan Esteban Arellano comes to mind, where he talks about querencia. In his view, querencia is what anchors people to the land. It builds knowledge of the environment and creates a sense of place. This idea of building knowledge in the environment, Enrique Lamadrid talks about that as well in some of his writings about querencia, that the longer a people, a culture, like our ancestors, some 400 years of living in the same place, living in the Moro Valley or Truchas or Española or El Rito or any of these other places, after 4 centuries of experience and in a particular place, they get to know the environment pretty well. And that gives them this sense of attachment to place. Mutualismo then becomes the element that connects individuals to groups by way of reciprocity. That just means people helping each other, exchanging and supporting mutually when somebody is in need. And then this idea of confianza under the idea of mutual trust, because you know that if you help your neighbor, entre vecinos, when you need help yourself, then they'll come and help you. That's the basic principle, because keeping in mind much of this developed in this Rio Arriba before government, before welfare, before other kinds of assistance. Then the final term here is the one that I'm really developing a lot right now are these arreglos. And basically I define them as these are arrangements negotiated with or between and across vecinos. And we can also describe them as acuerdos. And this is why it's very important to say these things in the language of the Rio Arriba, because when you try and translate a lot of these terms, they just don't have the same deep, meaning. Like to me, sure, arreglos, I could translate it as arrangement, as I have done here. I could translate it as agreement, but there's something about in Castellano, if you say arreglos, and especially in the context of some of these places, people know what that is. Arreglan algo, se ponen de acuerdo. They decide to do something mutually. That's what they do. And so that's the question that I have. Now, why did these forms of mutualismo and ayuda mutua and these forms of support, mutual help and support, why, historically, how did this happen? Well, for one reason is that El Rio Arriba, northern Rio Grande, New Mexico, and Colorado were at the very extreme end of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. Here you have it represented in this map from Mexico City all the way to Socorro, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and eventually at San Juan Pueblo, known today as Oqueowingue. This was a very much of a frontier. It was a rugged environment. It was desert, arid, semi-arid, and difficult to make a living. And so the people who came here were recruited from places like this that you see on this map, from Zacatecas, from Durango, from Chihuahua, up through and into current Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, El Paso, all the way to Santa Fe. And places north of that into places like Taos and Colorado that are not in this map. But essentially, this idea of coming to this remote De Vargas wrote a letter to his family during the time that he was governor, around 1694, 596 in there, and he said, New Mexico, remote beyond compare, and that's what he said to his family, that this is where he found himself being the governor of a place like this. So it was really basically out of necessity, because the goal at that time was to establish agricultural colonies. That was the only economy of the time, was farming and ranching, okay? And so with that, they had to figure out how to develop this economy. So this was one of the process that they went through, was this idea of mutual aid for survival based on arreglos entre vecinos. We see that, for example, from the very first time that the land grants were provided. You remember that map of El Camino Real? Well, that's about 1,500 miles from Mexico City all the way up here. So who would ever want to do that? And most of this is by walking or on horseback or on wagons or a combination of all of the above. And who would want to come here? Well, one of the reasons, one of the incentives was that if these families, these pobladores as they were called, would come here, they would be provided with land grants, be provided with land, okay? That was a strong incentive for people to become a landowner, because perhaps where they were from before, they did not have this. So one of the things that they established then was the Consejo de Vecinos. I'll say more about them. The acequias came right after the land grants, because in order to make the land productive, become and establish as an agricultural colony, you needed to put water on the land. And so again, they had to work together and develop this acequia. And in those days, acequia de común, basically a commons ditch, a community ditch. Okay. Also with that, religion was very important, another value people had. So they established their cofradías. Some of them were, of course, connected to the Catholic Church in that sense. But the ones that I study more than the ones connected to the church were the penitentes, the hermanos and los penitentes, because those truly are autonomous, even autonomous from the church. They build their own chapels. They have their own moradas, for example, that is not owned by the Catholic Church. It's owned by the hermanos de la cofradía. And then lastly, around 1880, after the railroad came into the region, there was a need for people to acquire wage labor employment in the mines, in the agricultural industries, or building track, for the railroad. And so they established these mutual aid societies, mutualidades, to support each other in time, because there was no unemployment insurance or health insurance. If somebody got injured on the job, some of these were dangerous occupations, such as in the mines. They had a system of support. Okay, land grants. This is probably a very good example, an early example of this arreglos entre vecinos. The pobladores were the settlers on the land. In fact, in a lot of the colonial period documents, there was this petition that people would then present to the governor of the Provincia del Nuevo Mexico and request a land grant. And many times in the petition itself, it was for the purpose of settlement and cultivation. Now, once the governor authorized a particular land grant, the property that was in the land grant was turned back over to the petitioners, the poblador principal and all the families that had been recruited for that particular parcel. So it was up to the pobladores then to take over this property and make decisions about that, like how to divide up la tierra, and it was called the repartimiento de tierras. So it's like we have the repartimiento de aguas in the acequias. Before that, there was the repartimiento de tierras. There was also the solares y los suertes. The solares were the places where the house would be built. The suertes were the irrigated land from the acequia typically down to the river. And then the government. These are all in the work that I've been doing and really has been part of my research purpose and objective, is to look at these organizations as basically people's institutions, because they're outside of government. They're recognized by government, but they're outside. They are autonomous in the sense of they elect their own leaders, establish their own rules, make their own decisions, and keep their records as well. So that certainly happened in the case of the land grants. One of the early things that they had to do once they were given possession of their land grant was to elect a board, like a town council in today's terms, I guess. It's called the Consejo de Vecinos, okay? Because they took vecinos, that's a very important word in and of itself. These were projects, this whole land to be developed and settled and cultivated, and even the digging out of the acequia. It was something that no single person or even one single family could do alone. They had to do it mutually, okay? It takes a lot of labor to build a presa, ¿verdad? To divert water from the rio and put it into the acequia madre and then have it go into the fields on the land. And so that was a very early example of a people's government, essentially, this Consejo de Vecinos. We know that the land grant, this is just one of the counties, this does happen to be the county of Rio Arriba. All of these colored areas on this map were land grants. There were much more than, there were probably about twice this number. Some were consolidated and some were never accepted by the Surveyor General. But nonetheless, you get the idea here that they basically followed the water. This is out of the confluence between the Rio Chama and the Rio Grande in the Española Valley, coming up to the Rio Chama and then into the tributaries of the Chama. So community followed the water. Water was essential. El agua es la vida, as they say. In terms of the acequias themselves, this Arreglos, entre vecinos, this is really where I first encountered this concept of Arreglos. It was in the territorial laws of 1851-52. And in the work that I do, I claim that these are the first water laws of New Mexico. Many lawyers or others say, well, the water law, it's 1907, 1908, New Mexico. And I said, no, the acequia laws are older than any of those. They actually go back to 1851-52, and even before that under Spanish and Mexican government. But even under U.S. jurisdiction, by this time, New Mexico was a territory, as we know, since 1848. There is in the books of territorial laws, the Assembly at that time adopted different laws for the acequias, and this is one of them. El arreglo de las acequias que ya están trabajadas quedará establecido tal como se hizo y permanece hasta hoy. So they're saying several things. They're saying, hey, these acequias were already here. They were here before the U.S. Okay, so they're saying they were already here. Not only that, the way that they have developed and the way they work out their system of distributing water, tal como se hizo, in the past, permanece hasta hoy. They are valid today. Okay, so this concept of el arreglo, I said, well, what do they mean by arreglos? Okay, well, I started to look into that a little more. And as I said, this was even before the U.S. territorial period, and much of this was by way of custom and tradition. Again, when people came, these pobladores, these vecinos, settled on the land, they had to invent a lot of things. They had to come up with their own government. They had to find a way of negotiating with each other as to how to use the land and what kind of grazing would be permitted on the land grant, for example. And so over time, these customs and traditions became written into what are the ditch rules of today, rules and regulations that in the court system carry the force of customary law if they're presented. Okay, so this was very important, this idea of custom and tradition, because on that map, we didn't get into the details of that, but every valley, I mentioned some of them already, maybe, as I've been going along, certainly the ones on the Rio Chama, which I've been studying a lot. Every valley, and certainly in the Taos Valley as well, the Mora Valley, the Peñasco area, all of those are the topography is different, the lay of the land is different, and so therefore the rules that people come up with are different from place to place. So every acequia is unique. in and of itself. There's no two acequias alike. And like I tell my students at the university, now that I've been studying them for all these 30-some years, I find them very intriguing, very interesting, because they're all different. They have to be. Their physical layout on the land is different, and therefore the rules that they develop are going to be different. They have to fit into that particular physical environment. And so I tell my students, well, I've been looking at these acequias, I still study them, and in fact, I've never met an acequia that I didn't like. Okay, that's why I keep doing this. Okay, El Camino Real, okay, talking about that already a little bit. Okay, so what is it, this collective labor? Why was it necessary for vecinos to establish these rules and this way of organizing themselves? Well, because the first thing that they had to do was actually decide where to build the first presa, where to take the water out of the stream, put it on the land, and then irrigate the fields and be able to feed the family. Literally. Okay, so they had to find a point at which to divert the water and put it into the acequia madre. This is an example of a very early kind of ditch. Presa. You still find these. These are just boulders and stones and trunks of trees and limbs of trees that were just laid down on the bottom of the Rio Pecos in this case in order to build up the level of the water behind the presa and then put it into that acequia madre, which is on the right-hand corner of this photograph here. So this is an example of a project that certainly one person, one farmer could not do this, even one family could not do this by themselves. It took the whole community to build this kind of a structure. In fact, in the writing that I do, I call these presas as the first public works in the Rio Arriba, or in New Mexico, southern Colorado. They were the first project. They were built even before the church, for example. So that's an early example. The other one that I mentioned earlier that shows this idea of mutual aid and support is during the cleaning of the ditch. Once after that presa is built and after the acequia madre is taken out, then every season there's this need to clean out the ditch. And this is an arrangement, un arreglo, permanece hasta hoy in this operations and maintenance of the acequia de común. And then there's even an assignment of tareas during that day. There's only one boss on that day, and it's the mayordomo. There could be lawyers there, school teachers, bus drivers, other farmers. There's a lot of people that are inside of the ditch the day of the cleaning, and it's the mayordomo who carries the day. And he does that by assigning tareas, basically a section of the ditch that Gabriel here would have to clean out, or someone else clean out the next section, and so on down the line. This is an example. This is a ditch cleaning, I believe, about 2-3 years ago in the Embudo. And the gentleman, el hombre with el palo, is the mayordomo of the Embudo, of this particular ditch, and mayordomo there. And that's what he's doing. The length of that rod, that stick, that's the length of the tarea, basically. Each of those people inside the ditch, they get to clean out that length of that section. And then when they finish all of that, then they jump forward and they clean out another section. So that's a very important concept there as well. They're still cleaning it out here. They're busy at work, and here they are. Okay. Okay, so after everything is built and operated for some time, we started to see a paisaje del agua, this kind of water landscape, which includes the presa, the compuertas. There's another presa. This is on the Rio Gemes. It's still the same thing, boulders, trunks of trees and so forth, still being used to this day. This is another kind of a diversion in Embudo itself. That's Esteban Arellano and Professor Tom Glick dividing the water there on the Rio Embudo. To the left is actually the Rio Embudo, but it's diverted on the right to be into one of the ditches in the Embudo itself. This is in Taos County. This is La Presa de la Cuchilla, as it's called, and this is the time that in the spring when the mayordomo there and 3 members of the acequia are opening that big water wheel to let the water come out, gush out for the first time. We also have other interesting features of this paisaje del agua that's created by the ditch. I call these the espejos de agua. It's actually a tanque, and this is in La Ciénaga, where water is put into a reservoir and then into the fields after that. We have canoas. You know, the theme for this talk here, we have an example of a homemade, flume, a culvert, if you will, but it's made out of materials from the forest. This is at Las Trampas. It's still there. Next time you pass through, just looks like you've been there. Yeah. Okay. It's very important because, to my knowledge, this is the still used surviving canoa made out of logs that is still in use. Many of these have been replaced by modern materials. Those were all hand carved out and then placed there in water. That is the acequia. That's a part of it. To cross the arroyos, that's what they had to do. In more modern times, there's also the partidor. These were also made of logs and stones in the old days. Now, sometimes cement is used, but it's an expression of how water is divided. That same acequia that we saw at La Cuchilla, which is just up from Valdez and into Des Montes, this is how the water is divided. So one acequia becomes two, and even some of those become 2 or 4 more. There's about 6 or 8 in this area that come off of this. Of course, we know about the acequia madre. This is an example of one. The linderos, or the sangrias on the farmers' fields. Part of the mutual bonding that takes place is by way of ritual. And other than the limpia, which itself is a ritual, we also know that there are processions and blessings of the ditch that happen in different places of New Mexico. And we'll get to one here in a minute. Yeah. Here's the blessing of the ditch at Rancho de las Golondrinas. And you can see it's a very formalized event. There's a procession that leads to this place, and the priest is blessing the water there. In some places, not all, but there's also the Matachines have a dance. They start really in the Mass inside the church. This is San Antonio de Padua, just near Cedar Crest, up the highway here, I-40, through Tijeras and up to San Antonio de Padua. And the Matachines dance musicians also come up and eventually come to this place, and the priest there blesses the water of this ojito. That's the source of irrigation for that. Cofradías y moradas, those I'll go over a little bit more quickly. This is an example. I mentioned that they are basically autonomous. The people themselves, just like they had to build their own presa y acequia madre, they also had to build this. They had to build their own chapel, if you will, what they call the morada. This is in Talpa. This is still a currently in use morada in Talpa. And much like the acequias, they also had journals and notebooks and written records of their minutes. And here's some examples of that. So there was a lot of similarity between acequias and the cofradías and how they organized themselves, this concept of mutualismo, hermanidad, and then how they express that in their rule books, and even in the case of written minutes. This is from 1922, for example, a journal of minutes. This is how much they cared about their society. This is a slightly different kind of society. These are the mutualidades, as I call them, or sociedades mutualistas, and they started a little later than the cofradías for sure, and after the acequias, around 1880, when people went out and sought work, and they had to leave the farm, perhaps permanently or perhaps temporarily, but be able to generate some wage employment for themselves, working in the mines or the traque of the railroad or in the ranchos or other places. And so they had a need to establish their own society. This one was established in 1900, 30 years before the Social Security. And they had their own fund of money to support people when they were laid off from work or when they were injured in work, or if somebody passed away, which, when that happened, then they had a burial fund, el entierro. They would pay the cost of the funeral, the expenses, and then they would collect money and support the widow and the kids that were left behind. And so they did all of this through their own contributions. Nobody required them to do this. They did it on their own. This is the organization, as Gabriel mentioned earlier. Some of these still survive. This one is in Antonito, if you ever have been through that town. And this is their headquarters in Concilio Superior. And it's on the landmark of historic buildings nationally. This was an early use of that same building in the early 30s. This was their legislature, to give you an idea. There were many more members than this. There were about 2,000. They were in Colorado, New Mexico, and in Utah. There were 65 concilio locales at one time. They were organized like the cofradías de morada level, local. Okay, so they established kind of like the same type of organization, and this was just their legislative body that came out for this photograph on that day. They have their own rules, just like acequias tienen los arreglos. Estos son los arreglos. These are the rules of the Sociedad Protección Mutua in this código. Okay. At the time of burial, often in the headstones, they'll have the name of the organization. This is a Señor Archuleta in his birth and the year that he died. And then at the bottom, you'll see the initials, the SPMDTU. They also have their initials in some of their salas, just like the cofradías de hermanos penitentes had to build their own moradas out of adobe and local materials and so forth. Well, these Sociedades Mutualistas did the same thing. For them, the purpose was not as a chapel, but it was their meeting hall. This is where they conducted business. This is where they established their rules. This is where they elected their officers. This is where they put together the help that perhaps the neighbor was needing because there's some emergency had come about, or somebody's house burned down or something. They would, establish their own form of financial and emergency assistance in meeting halls like this. This is in Costilla. It's still there, no longer as a concilio, but as an art gallery. Okay, this is another place, El Rito. This building is still there. You can't really see the depth of these, but many of these buildings were large enough that these were really the social centers of the community, and certainly that was the case in El Rito because it was a little bit isolated, and there were bailes, a dance hall. There were, other kinds of social events, títeres. Anybody heard that word in a while? What's a títere? Puppet show, right? And so these were the places these were the community centers, and that people would gather and come to, whether you were a member or not. That was the place, that was what held the community together for a long time in places like El Rito. What do these salas look like on the inside? Well, here they are. Same thing, Las Vigas, and El Techo, and the members, posing here for a group photograph. I believe this was at Ranchos de Taos. Okay, and it's still active. In the year 2000, they had their centennial anniversary. It's the oldest Hispanic civil rights organization of record. They're older than the LULACs. In fact, the LULACs kind of followed the structure of the SPMDTU. The LULACs also have concilios locales, council number 1, council number 10, in Raton or Albuquerque or somewhere else. And so the LULACs have their conventions. Well, this organization has had a biannual convention for over a century now, and this was at the time of, this is the inside of that large building. They have their own rituals of expressing their mutual support. They call themselves, just like the cofradías, or the penitentes son hermanos, ¿verdad? Uno de los otros. Well, the sociedades también, that's the word that they use. These are the hermanos of the sociedad. Okay. This is the convention in Denver, a little bit later than the black and white photo that I showed you. This is one of the officers of the society. And in 1978, the organization amended its constitution, and it included that women could join the society. So now tenemos hermanas y hermanos de los dos. The next convention happens to be a year from now. It's also going to be in Denver. This was the Denver convention some years ago. And here the new members are being initiated, so they have rituals of initiation as well. These are the divisas. These are the ribbons that they wear to express their membership, and the different versions of it, including some for women's auxiliaries. Okay, conclusions. What is it? this question that I've been raising, what are the roots of community? What have been the foundations of community in the Rio Arriba? Well, it's pretty complex, as you can see from this list. I won't, go through an explanation of all of them, but basically this idea of connection to a place, this querencia, of where you're from, this idea of mutual support, people helping each other out, vecinos, this idea of confianza, of mutual trust, this idea of cultural identity. Everybody's from a place in New Mexico. You probably know when you meet somebody, you're very curious, right? You say, well, where are you from? They say, well, I'm from Albuquerque. That happens here in this. No, but before that, well, I've always been from here. Well, what about your parents? Where are they from? Well, I think they came from Española. And then what about your grandparents? Well, before, then they came from somewhere else, maybe, let's say, Embudo or Santa Cruz. One of the early settlements was in Santa Cruz after Santa Fe. So anyway, so this idea of cultural identity and this imaginario colectivo, basically this kind of like imagined but real at the same time, that there's something here, there's a connection that people have. They remember a lot of things collectively. It's in the memory, as we express further down on this list, this sort of social memory or collective memory, especially is carried forward by the elders. In terms of the government of these systems, what I call these people's institutions, whether they're the acequias, the land grants, or the cofradías, they all have this autonomy and tareas. People carry on different duties and different jobs. This idea of being able to decide things quickly, certainly in the question of acequias, that's one of the reasons why they have survived this long, because they control the water. They own the water rights collectively, and then they can decide when to take it out in the spring, when it's ready, there's enough there, how to distribute it, and how to share it across vecinos, ¿verdad? According to the arreglos that they have established. So if there's a drought period, like we've experienced in the last few years, they're able to make some changes to respond to that. If there's a serious shortage, they have capacity to recover. They bounce back in this, and they come back the following year. They don't give up. Solidarity, a very important one. People hang together. Basically, this is part of that mutualism expressed in this idea of the solidarity, because they've been subjected to change way before the recent drought. There's been droughts before. There's been technical change. Drip irrigation has become popular. There's been political change. These systems were started under the Spanish government, later the Mexican government, the U.S. territorial government of New Mexico, and then statehood in 1912. So gosh, if they've survived all of that, they must have something that holds them together. That is the question that we have in these research studies. Then we're also concerned about, well, they've survived this long, will they survive into the future? Well, a critical component is basically the idea of being able to carry forward, to transfer this knowledge to the youth and to the new generations. And fortunately, I'll end with these because they express the future. This is a nice project by the New Mexico Acequia Association, okay, and it's called Sembrando Semillas. These are the semillas. They're planting them in the ground. But the kids that you see there, the boys and the girls, they're part of their semillas. They're the future for this particular community. This happens to be in Don Fernando de Taos in the Taos County, and they're learning how to work with a shovel, how to put things together. This is the board of directors of the New Mexico Acequia Association, and here's how much they are anchored, into the land, and how much they value the water that irrigates their farms, and they're making it loud and clear. Our water is not for sale. Because in New Mexico, if you have looked into this a bit, water is a piece of property. It can be bought and sold. It can be taken out of that acequia and put to other use in the city or in industry or whatever. Well, the board of directors feels very strongly that that's the key to their goals of continuing into the next generation, to train the young people, but also to keep the water in the community. This is just a list of the photo credits that I have. These are people that loaned me and gave me permission to use their artwork or their photographs in the acequia cleaning and embudo. Miguel Gandert, who's going to be featured here in La Canoa series, I think he's coming up pretty soon, right? Yeah, he loaned me some. He did the work on San Antonio de Padua, the Matachines. He's famous for that. And so I thank all of them for loaning these to me, and I acknowledge the partners that we've had in this work. It's been the University of New Mexico State University, New Mexico Technology University, Sandia Labs, and the New Mexico Acequia Association. So with that, I'll certainly, if any of you have any feedback, any comments, any questions, please let me know.
Can you mention about the water courts?
Well, the water courts, yeah, in Valencia. We happened to, New Mexico was really put on the global stage, okay, last September 2014. The acequias originate out of Islamic Arabic Spain. You know, we think we've been here for a long time, 400 years. Well, the Arabic and Muslim people from North Africa and the Middle East and Egypt and places like that, the Berbers and others, the Moors, they were in southern Spain twice as long, 800 years. And they're really the ones that transformed the desert lands of southern Spain, which are very similar to our landscapes here. They turned them into gardens and into the oasis, and they did it by way of these acequias. So the acequias of Valencia have held a water court every Thursday at noon in front of the Cathedral of Valencia. And these are all irrigators. Over there, they're called acequieros. Here, yeah, same thing, we use that word here too, but there's a acequiero principal or presidente, and also sometimes when they meet as a court, they're called syndicos, syndics basically. And those are irrigators. They hold court. They're a classic people's institution, same thing. They're irrigators, they form their own government, they come together on Thursdays and they hold court. If somebody violates a law, an regla, like they watered out a turn, like what happens here in New Mexico, right? Or they flooded the neighbor's field, that happens in New Mexico as well. They take more water than they're not supposed to. That happens over there, happens here. They take these people to court and on that Thursday at noon, and we were there. We were there in September 2014. New Mexico was singled out as a hermanidad, ¿verdad? Hermanamiento, they called it, basically like a sister city kind of concept, uniting and creating an alliance, recognizing that there's a common heritage between the acequias of Valencia and the acequias of New Mexico. Because they know that their kind of acequia government came across the ocean, came into Mexico, came up the Camino Real, and here we are in New Mexico and Colorado. This is the only region in the U.S., anyway, where you still find this kind of an institution. And they were aware of that, and they celebrated that. They presented the New Mexico Acequia Association with a medalla de oro, their gold medal. Usually that's reserved for dignitaries like ambassadors and ministers of other foreign governments that visit Valencia, and they're honored in that way. Well, in this case, we had the acequias of New Mexico that were honored. So that was really a high point in the acequia history. So, anything else?
Yes.
Yes.
The acequia associations, are they completely independent of state water authorities or whatever you want to call it?
No, there's still state regulation. They still have to comply with state water laws and conform to state legislature and to the office of the state engineer. But in terms of decision making, once they have their water right allocated, either adjudication or just by customary use, and they can claim that in court even before adjudication, before the state engineer says you have this much water and the other acequia has less or more or whatever. Okay, they can still claim under customary law that the amount of water that they're entitled to, they can continue to divert. So basically, that's the autonomy of the water right, but they are regulated by the state. But it comes with another kind of benefit too. They are recognized as political subdivisions of the state of New Mexico. That's really rare for a government of this kind, what I call these people's institutions, these arreglos entre los vecinos, you know, for them to actually have recognition by the state legislature as governments, basically. But they are also autonomous at the same time.
In that note, how much the Arreglos entre vecinos influence modern water laws or water?
Yeah, sure. Well, they're in the statutes. There's chapter 49, I believe, of the state statutes of New Mexico. The whole book is about acequia laws. You know, going back to 1851, 1852, and even earlier times, there's precedents in law when court cases are decided. They're put into the book of state statutes. So they have been recognized and validated as community ditches in the state laws of New Mexico. So yes, they've had their influence. And now they have ability to actually make decisions, just like the water courts of Valencia. They have ability to make, decide infractions and things like that. And by the way, the interesting thing about Valencia, just as here, the person that comes before the water court is called a denunciado. You know, that sounds like a pretty strong term, but it works. Basically, that person, they're put on the spot before the judges, lo denuncian, basically. You don't want to be a denunciado for very long. So whatever the judges fine you, they fine you €5 or €10 or whatever, you got to pay it because you don't want. Remind me of here in New Mexico, in Mora, we use this term delincuente. If you don't show up for ditch cleaning day in the springtime, you'll be a delincuente. And you know, you translate that into English, who among us would want to be a delinquent and labeled by your vecinos that way and looked upon as a delinquent, and you're not going to want to stay there. So same thing here, the mayordomo can impose a fine on you and you have to pay it. And in the older laws, and they're still in the books, you either pay it or you go to prison, you go to jail, okay, if you don't pay it, okay? So it's all very interesting parallels. So they do have this authority. That mayordomo, by the way, in state statutes recognize the mayordomo has police powers, literally. I mean, those are the words that I use. You know, just like a government, like the city of Albuquerque has police powers to protect the safety, public health, safety, and welfare of all Albuquerque citizens. They're able to police, basically, and enforce violations. Well, the mayordomo has police powers in the acequia. Sí, señor.
El cañoncito, you know where that's at?
Hay varios, ¿a cuál de ellos?
No, entre las Guadalupitas y Luciana.
Sí, sí lo conozco.
There's a couple of ditches there. When I was a kid, my mom taught me cañoncito. And there was a ditch now. There was a ditch. Now it's no water. The ditch is still there, but there's no water flowing through it. What governs all that as far as?
Well, yeah, sometimes ditches get abandoned. They're no longer in use, and there's a forfeiture law in the state statutes that if it's not, a water right is not used for 5 years, it can be forfeited. Okay, so up to now, no forfeiture has occurred under state law, but that particular ditch, if it's been abandoned, then chances are it would be difficult to put water back in there. But every case is different. You know, I don't know how long it's been abandoned, but that does happen. Mm-hmm.
Is
Yeah.
Mexico the only, oh, I'm sorry.
It's just a real shame because as a kid, you know, that water was, like you said, la vida de la comunidad.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to play in it and get water from it and everything else. And now, these people, it's like, they don't want to do it, but they want to sell, they're anxious to sell the water rights to bigger cities. And that's happened in Las Vegas. They sold a lot of their water rights to Las Cruces. And now they're hurting for water.
Sure. Okay. So you had a question here?
Is New Mexico the only state in the United States and it still has the acequias?
This kind of acequia, yes. New Mexico and southern Colorado.
So,
Yes, they used to be all over, believe it or not. Los Angeles tenía una acequia madre, ¿verdad? You see the old maps of Los Angeles? There was the Rio, and then off of the Rio was this acequia madre. And guess what? Los Angeles, now, guess what they're trying to do? They're trying to recover that heritage. They're trying to literally find where that pathway, they're not going to be able to put the water back for agriculture anymore on it, but they want to recognize the heritage. This was here, this is what created Los Angeles, you know, and they're restoring the river as well. They have a big project going on. Other cities are doing that. San Antonio, Texas did that some time ago. You know, you probably, how many of you been to the river walk? A bunch of us, right? That's what that was, that San Antonio River, there were 2 or 3 ditches for the city itself of San Antonio de Béjar, but also there were 5 big ones for the missions that were in the south of San Antonio along both banks of the Rio de San Antonio. San Antonio, they recognize that. They have, every time they discover, because they dig up the roads for repairs or something, they find a fragment, a segment of a ditch, they'll stop construction. They'll bring in archaeologists and study it and say, okay, was this an acequia or not? And if they can establish that it was, usually what happens is they'll, leave it alone. They'll remove debris or things like that. They'll put a plaque and say, this is the acequia. It's actually one there, right there in the Alamo. Those of you who've been to San Antonio, you can't go to San Antonio without going to the Alamo. Ahí está una. And it says there, acequia madre, and it runs right behind the Alamo. It's not used for that. It's used for tourism now. And in fact, the Riverwalk is all tourism. So San Antonio's birth, its history, was based on water. Okay, well, its economy is largely based on this tourism industry that they have, including the Riverwalk. Sí, señor.
It's funny that you said that about plaques, because in Mexico City, it was a canal city, right? It was a Venice.
The Chinampas.
And we have these big bronze markers like that in the city, on the street, telling you why it was and when they started filling all those canals in, the sewers and the water and electricity, they had to put these markers in. I just found it fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, Mexico City, there were Chinampas. There's only 3 left, San Gregorio, San Luis, and Xochimilco, I think, are the ones that still have these Chinampas. Gabriel?
When you think about all of the factors that have come against mutualismo or this communal notion in New Mexico, where would you put the Depression, the New Deal, and that change that came from self-sustaining communities?
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah, the Great Depression, it brought about the need for the federal government to step in. President Roosevelt and all the New Deal, there were lots of the New Deal projects all over the country, including, of course, here. And so then government stepped in and created these forms of social support that the people themselves had been, in charge of before. And so that did have an impact. The Sociedades Mutualistas, the acequias still continue. They did not change because of the Depression. But the Sociedades Mutualistas, like the one in Colorado that I showed you, New Mexico and Utah, they were greatly impacted by that because then now government started providing unemployment insurance or health insurance or when people, were injured at work or something like that. And so, yeah, the federal government took over many of these functions. And so there was a decline, a very sharp decline. It didn't happen overnight, but over a few decades, then there wasn't as strong a need for these sociedades. So that did have. Another game changer after the Depression was World War II. The whole economy changed a second time there. The railroad was a big change, brought industry and wage economy to this region. But then the next one was the World War II, and that changed the economy. That one did affect acequias because people started leaving the land, moving to cities, the out-migration from places. I'm amazed at how many people come out of San Antonito, Colorado. I mean, I meet people from there all the time. Equally so, people from the Mora Valley. They're in Denver, they're in Pueblo, they're in Phoenix, they're in San Diego. They're all over the map. Your relatives, I'm sure, they're all over the map too. And so that was the cause of a lot of the rural out-migration, was the wage economy after World War II. Yeah, New Mexico entered the modern era, in effect. Here we have Sandia Labs, we have Los Alamos Labs, and we have White Sands Missile Range. We have a major university as institutions, so that was bound to happen. But the interesting thing is that these acequias still hang on to the land. They don't sell their water rights. Yes, I think there may have been some other ones here. No, más preguntas.
I have another one.
Yeah.
So, if you think about the construction, say, of aqueducts and water systems, even in Mexico, there's a couple. I think there's 2 aqueducts that are stone. They follow the model of Roman aqueducts, and they're pretty impressive. And then, of course, in Spain, there's others in
There,
Europe.
sure.
So, but my question is, so the lack of the use of stone and all of that, would you attribute that, is that because we're in this frontier provincial, it's not as, there's not gremios, or what is it that, why didn't people develop some of those things with stone?
Well, these are all locally specific. In San Antonio, they did use stone because there was plenty available. That particular stone, limestone, yeah, it's limestone. It's easy to carve out and block it and build a wall or build a mission. Many of the missions were built out of limestone. The presas there were some of them, like the Espada, a famous one. That's on the National Historic Register also, is the Presa de Espada in San Antonio. That was built out of that. But in New Mexico, we didn't have, quarries of stone that could be easily mined. We didn't have the kind of, this is colonial period, it's frontier, just like you were saying. So what material was the most available here? There were these boulders and stones and trunks of trees that were found lying around, and then logs from the forest. So it was, local construction material. Because these were projects entre los vecinos, They could assemble the labor force, and they did. Well, what did they do? They gathered the material that they needed, There are some acecas that are stone in some way. The stone support, to control soil erosion and things like that. And of course, in modern times, cement, some of the ditches are cement lined now.
The thing that's wrong with cement, and the Anglos are real big on lining the ditches with cement, is that if you don't let the water go horizontally, you kill off all the trees and all the vegetation. That happened in Villanueva, in the elbow, and they found out that by putting sandstone, which they could land, it's flagstone, which they could mine locally, they started laying that in there so that the trees could get water.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah, that's part of what we're doing in this National Science Foundation study. Some of the hydrologists that work with us from New Mexico State and from the Alcalde Experimental Station over there, that's also New Mexico State, they actually sunk wells in Alcalde because they own that piece of property. It's part of their extension service work. And they proved that point because the acequeros, or these parciantes and mayordomos, they had been saying that we don't want ditch lining because it'll kill off the vegetation that grows along the ditch bank, the cottonwoods, the ciruela, and all these others. And that's, wildlife depends on some of those cooled environments and stuff. So, and the main thing, as you exactly pointed out, they recharge the aquifer basically to support this kind of vegetation.
It's nice to have a nice smooth surface,
Yeah.
because you have to clean it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
That's
help
right. It filters the water too, it cleans it. When it goes through soil, that water, if there's any contaminants in it or whatever, even debris, simple debris that gets in any water course that's open, once it sinks into the ground, it gets cleaned up. When it enters back to the river, because that recharges that local aquifer, like at Alcalde, that's published in a science journal article, and it returns back to the river. The water we see now in the Rio Grande, a lot of it, well, not a lot of this, but some of this is water that was irrigated up in Taos Valley or Española Valley during the summer. It's finally getting here. So they have the return flow back to the river. Aquí, señor, sí.
I was wondering, when you did your travels to different countries, Peru and the Philippines, did you find the exchange of the common good with people stronger in other countries, or, there was more of a bond in Peru than in the Philippines or the United States, or is this a common?
And those are the words that I use. Just like a government, like the city of Albuquerque has police powers to protect the safety, public health, safety, and welfare of all Albuquerque citizens. They're able to police, basically, and enforce violations. Well, the mayordomo has police powers in the acequia. Sí, señor.
El Cañoncito, you know where that's at?
Hay varios, ¿a cuál de ellos?
Entre las Guaneritas y Anunciada.
Sí, sí lo conozco.
There's a couple of ditches there. When I was a kid, my mom taught me Cañoncito, and there was a ditch now. There was a ditch. Now it's no water. The ditch is still there, but there's no water flowing through it. What governs all that as far as?
Well, yeah, sometimes ditches get abandoned. They're no longer in use, and there's a forfeiture law in the state statutes that if it's not, a water right is not used for 5 years, it can be forfeited. Okay, so up to now, no forfeiture has occurred under state law, but that particular ditch, if it's been abandoned, then chances are it would be difficult to put water back in there. But every case is different. You know, I don't know how long it's been abandoned, but that does happen.
Is
Yeah.
Mexico the only, oh, I'm sorry.
It's just a real shame because as a kid, you know, that water was, like you said, la vida de la comunidad. And we used to play in it and get water from it and everything else. And now, these people, it's like, they don't want to do it, but they want to sell, they're anxious to sell the water rights to the bigger cities. And that's happened in Las Vegas. They sold a lot of the water rights to Las Cruces. And now they're hurting the water.
Sure. Okay. So you had a question here?
Is New Mexico the only state in the United States that it still has the acequias?
This kind of acequia, yes. New Mexico and southern Colorado.
So,
Yes, they used to be all over, believe it or not. Los Angeles tenía una acequia madre, ¿verdad? You see the old maps of Los Angeles? There was the Rio, and then off of the Rio was this acequia madre. And guess what? Los Angeles, now, guess what they're trying to do? They're trying to recover that heritage. They're trying to literally find where that pathway, they're not going to be able to put the water back for agriculture anymore on it, but they want to recognize the heritage. This was here. This is what created Los Angeles, you know, and they're restoring the river as well. They have a big project going on. Other cities are doing that. San Antonio, Texas did that some time ago. You know, you probably, how many of you been to the river walk? A bunch of us, right? That's what that was, that San Antonio River, there were 2 or 3, you know, ditches for the city itself of San Antonio de Béjar, but also there were 5 big ones for the missions that were in the south of San Antonio along both banks of the Rio de San Antonio. San Antonio, they recognize that. They have, every time they discover, because they dig up the roads for repairs or something, they find a fragment, a segment of a ditch, they'll stop construction. They'll bring in archaeologists and study it and say, okay, was this an acequia or not? And if they can establish that it was, usually what happens is they'll, you know, leave it alone. They'll remove debris or things like that. They'll put a plaque and say, this is the acequia. You know, it's actually one there, right there in the Alamo. Those of you who've been to San Antonio, you can't go to San Antonio without going to the Alamo. Ahí está una. And it says there, acequia madre, you know, and it runs right behind the Alamo. You know, it's not used for that. It's used for tourism now. And in fact, the river walk is all tourism. So San Antonio's birth, its history, was based on water, okay? Well, its economy is largely based on this tourism industry that they have, including the Riverwalk. Sí, señor.
It's funny that you said about plaques, because in Mexico City, it was a canal city, right? It was a Venice.
The Chinampas.
And they have these big bronze markers like that in the city, on the street, telling you why it was and what, when they started filling all those canals in, with the sewers and the water and electricity, they had to put these markers in. I just found it fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, Mexico City, there were Chinampas. There's only 3 left, San Gregorio, San Luis, and Xochimilco, I think, are the ones that still have these Chinampas. Gabriel?
When you think about all of the factors that have come against mutualismo or this communal notion in New Mexico, where would you put the Depression, the New Deal, and that change that came from you know, self-sustaining communities?
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah, the Great Depression, it brought about the need for the federal government to step in. President Roosevelt and all the New Deal, there were lots of the New Deal projects all over the country, including, of course, here. And so then government stepped in and created these forms of social support that the people themselves had been, you know, in charge of before. And so that did have an impact. The Sociedades Mutualistas, the acequias still continue. They did not change because of the Depression. But the Sociedades Mutualistas, like the one in Colorado that I showed you, New Mexico and Utah, they were greatly impacted by that, because then now government started providing unemployment insurance or health insurance, or when people, you know, were injured at work or something like that. And so, yeah, the federal government took over many of these functions. conditions. And so there was a decline, a very sharp decline. It didn't happen overnight, but over a few decades, then there wasn't as strong a need for these sociedades, so that did have. Another game changer after the Depression was World War II. The whole economy changed a second time there. The railroad was a big change, brought industry and wage economy to this region, but then the next one was the World War II, and that changed the economy. That one did affect acequias because people started leaving the land, moving to cities, the out-migration from places. I'm amazed at how many people come out of San Antonito, Colorado. I mean, I meet people from there all the time. Equally so, people from the Mora Valley. They're in Denver, they're in Pueblo, they're in Phoenix, they're in San Diego. They're all over the map. Your relatives, I'm sure, they're all over the map too. And so that was the cause of a lot of the rural out-migration, was the wage economy after World War II. Yeah, New Mexico entered the modern era, in effect. Here we have Sandia Labs, we have Los Alamos Labs, and we have White Sands Missile Range. We have a major university as institutions, so that was bound to happen. But the interesting thing is that these acequias still hang on to the land. They don't sell their water rights. Yes, I think there may have been some other ones here. No, más preguntas.
I have another one.
Yeah.
So, if you think about the construction, say, of aqueducts and water systems, even in Mexico, there's a couple. I think there's 2 aqueducts that are stone. They follow the model of Roman aqueducts, and they're pretty impressive. And then, of course, in Spain, there's others in
There,
Europe.
sure.
So, but my question is, so the lack of the use of stone and all of that, would you attribute that? Is that because we're in this frontier, provincial? There's not gremios, or what is it? Why didn't people develop some of those things with stone?
Well, these are all locally specific. In San Antonio, they did use stone because there was plenty available. That particular stone, limestone, it's limestone. It's easy to carve out and block it and build a wall or build a mission. Many of the missions were built out of limestone. The presas there were some of them, like the Espada, a famous one. That's on the National Historic Register also, is the presa de Espada in San Antonio. That was built out of that. But in New Mexico, we didn't have, quarries of stone that could be easily mined. We didn't have the kind of, this is colonial period, it's frontier, just like you were saying. So what material was the most available here? There were these boulders and stones and trunks of trees that were found lying around, and then logs from the forest. So it was, local construction material. Because these were projects entre los vecinos, They could assemble the labor force, and they did. Well, what did they do? They gathered the material that they needed, There are some acequias that are stone in some way. The stone support, to control soil erosion and things like that. And of course, in modern times, cement. Some of the ditches are cement lined now.
The thing that's wrong with cement, and the Anglos are real big on lining the ditches with cement, is that if you don't let the water go horizontally, you kill off all the trees and all the vegetation. That happened in Villanueva, in the elbow, and they found out that by putting sandstone, which they could land, it's flagstone, which they could mine locally, they started laying that in there so that the trees could get water.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah, that's part of what we're doing in this National Science Foundation study. Some of the hydrologists that work with us from New Mexico State and from the Alcalde Experimental Station over there, that's also New Mexico State, they actually sunk wells in Alcalde because they own that piece of property. It's part of their extension service work. And they proved that point because the acequieros, or these Parciantes and mayordomos, they had been saying that we don't want ditch lining because it'll kill off the vegetation that grows along the ditch bank, the cottonwoods, the ciruela, and all these others. And that's, wildlife depends on some of those cooled environments and stuff. So, and the main thing, as you exactly pointed out, they recharge the aquifer basically to support this kind of vegetation.
It's nice to have a nice smooth surface, but
Yeah.
you have to clean it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
That's
help
right. It filters the water too, it cleans it. When it goes through soil, that water, if there's any contaminants in it or whatever, even debris, simple debris that gets in any water course that's open, once it sinks into the ground, it gets cleaned up. When it enters back to the river, because that recharges that local aquifer, like at Alcalde, that's published in a science journal article, and it returns back to the river. The water we see now in the Rio Grande, a lot of well, not a lot of this, but some of this is water that was irrigated up in Taos Valley or Española Valley during the summer. It's finally getting here. So they have the return flow back to the river. Aquí, señor, sí.
I was wondering, when you did your travels to different countries, Peru and the Philippines, did you find the exchange of the common good with people stronger in other countries, or, you know, there was more of a bond in Peru than in the Philippines or the United States, or is this a common goal?
Well, a lot of the, yeah, certainly a lot of similarities. That's what really I was looking for. And this idea of community, you know, support, this annual, all of them have a limpia. They have to, because in the traditional way, these are the traditional ones that I've been describing. They're all earthen, okay, in Mexico, Peru, southern Spain, and the Philippines. They're not ditch lined yet, the ones that I study, okay? So yeah, they have that, they have a need. So they do the same thing. They elect their people's governments too. They elect their own officers, their rules, and so, you know, very similar. So that's one of the things that I found. Sí, señor.
I heard a story a while back, when you were talking about the canoa, how back in the, I can't remember what year it was, that these, the Army Corps engineers and all these others from wherever they came from, came up north, and they told the elders, oh, you can't have one of those, that piece of wood out there because it's not modern, it's not structural, you can't measure the water. Well, the elders said, well, I guess these guys know what they're talking about. So they put in a corrugated piece of pipe in there. A few years later, the whole pipe was rotten, falling down. So the elders from the community said, let's go to the forest. They found another tree, hollowed it out, and they put the canoa back in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true.
I really just want to give Jose a really great hand.
Okay.